Why, thank you. All right, so this, as the title of the talk suggests, is a talk on fake news. This paper was actually originally designed to be presented at a conference here in Bucharest on post-truth politics and fake news. But due to the fact that I was in Germany at the time the conference was occurring, I was unable to attend it. I have now written a 10,000-word monstrosity of a paper, and the paper that's going in the proceedings from that conference is only meant to be 5,000 words in length. So I've got a fair amount of fake news I need to cut out on my paper on fake news. And when talking about fake news, I can't help but think of probably one of the biggest proponents of news which is fake, which of course was the American ringmaster P.T. Barnum, whose travelling show that went around the continental United States was the kind of thing that would dazzle and amaze people, even though almost everything he presented was indeed a fake. From mermaids to copies of the Ten Commandments inscribed by God at Mount Sinai. But what's interesting about fake news is, of course, it's a really big issue at this particular point in time. And indeed, there's a lot of academic discussion about fake news going on at this particular moment. I myself have already written a paper on fake news that was published back in 2017 in the Romanian journal Public Reason, and I define fake news as an allegation that some story is misleading, it contains significant omissions, or even false, it is a lie, designed to deceive its intended audience. The Australian epistemologist Neil Levy, later that year, also wrote a paper on fake news, defining it as the presentation of false claims that purport to be about the world in a format and with a content that resembles the format and content of legitimate media organisations. And then earlier this year, my friend Axel Galfert, who's currently in Berlin, wrote a paper on the definitions of fake news, coming up with the eventual definition that fake news is the deliberate presentation of typically false or misleading claims as news, where the claims are misleading by design. Now, to cut things short, I'm going to be working with Axel's definition. I think it's quite similar to mine, but he actually does include the notion that fake news is news which is designated as fake. Well, I just talk about some story, so his is a slightly more precise version of my definition. But it's interesting to look at other definitions like that of Levy. So when Levy talks about fake news, he includes under the umbrella of fake news not just news which is fake, but also the presentation of claims which have not been adequately checked. So for Levy, if you disseminate news which is false, you are in the production of fake news. And I think that's probably a step too far, because we've already got a term for that. That's called sloppy journalism. We all know that when people present stories, sometimes inaccuracies or inadequate reporting occurs. So after any major world event, news organizations tend to rush to print, and sometimes you will get elements of fabrication or false claims in a media narrative that, if the news organization is doing their job properly, they will modify or notify people about within the next few days. But sometimes it turns out that in modern capitalist systems, reporting is such that editors don't have time to go back and issue corrections, or reporters don't have time to go back and check their stories. And so misleading claims can be made, but they're not misleading by design, they're misleading by accident. And this talk of intentionality, what is the intention of the people producing fake news, is going to be a big issue as we see in this talk. So Axel's definition, fake news is the deliberate presentation of typically false or misleading claims as news, where the claims are misleading by design, focuses quite specifically on the notion that fake news has to be misleading by design. So the producer of fake news needs to be setting out to mislead, and they need to have a target audience in mind. So when you are producing fake news, you are misleading by design a particular audience in the world. And he points out that this allows us to distinguish between news which happens to be fake, but is also satirical. So the notion of satirical news, things like The Onion, The Daily Show, elements of Last Week Tonight with John Oliver, will sometimes present news which is fake, but they're not trying to mislead anyone because the target audience of those broadcasts, all those broadsheets, are very much aware of what the producer is doing. So there are famous satirical newspapers like Private Eye in the UK, which if you were to read them with no knowledge of what the purpose of the newspaper was, you would be misled to a very large extent by British politics. But Private Eye is not aimed towards the lay audience, it's aimed towards people who know exactly what is going on. And if it misleads people by accident, that was never the intention of the editors in that particular case. But what's interesting about Axel's definition is that he says fake news is the deliberate presentation of typically false or misleading claims. And that leads to a very interesting question of whether fake news can be made up of entirely true statements. So given that fake news can be merely misleading, is it possible to have a fake news story which contains no fabrications in it whatsoever? And what we might think of here is that news and news stories tend to exist on a spectrum from a low resemblance, i.e. fake representation of the world, to a high resemblance or factual representation of the world. Now, we'd be tempted to think that fake news sits somewhere around the low resemblance part, because fake news, obviously by its name, is fake. But some stories which are entirely true will turn out to be, under this definition, fake news, because they are still misleading. Now, there's a very, very, very famous speech made in the 1960s in a Democratic primary where one Democratic contender, George Smathers, decided that he needed to tell the target of his campaigning that his opponent, Claude Pepper, was a terrible human being. And this is what he said. Are you aware that Claude Pepper is known all over Washington as a shameless extrovert? Not only that, but this man is reliably reported to practice nepotism with his sister-in-law. He has a brother who is a known Homo sapiens, and he has a sister who was once a thespian in wicked New York. Worst of all, it is an established fact that Mr. Pepper, before his marriage, habitually practiced celibacy. Now, as far as we're aware, all of these statements about Claude Pepper are true. And yet, what George Smathers is doing in this situation is trying to mislead his audience into thinking Claude Pepper is a bad person, because his audience won't know what a Homo sapiens is, but they're pretty sure it's something very, very bad. Now, unfortunately for history, there's no actual evidence this speech was ever actually made. It's attributed to George Smathers. George Smathers had a very, very successful career in several Republican administrations, despite the fact that he was a Democrat at the time. And he has denied to his dying day that this speech was ever given. It only appears in news reports and has all the qualities of what appears to be an urban myth. But we do find examples of similar situations where politicians say things which are true, but are still misleading. So this cheeky chappy here is Simon Bridges. And Simon Bridges is the current leader of the National Party of New Zealand. The National Party were the previous government back in Aotearoa, New Zealand, but are currently now in opposition. And because they're in opposition, they have to, of course, oppose what the left-wing Labour government is doing at this particular point in time. And one of the things that the Labour Party is doing back in Aotearoa, New Zealand, is rescinding this thing called the Three Strikes Law, which is modelled on an American idea that every time you commit a particular type of criminal offence, you get a strike. And if you commit 2 strike offences, on your 3rd strike offence, you must have the maximum period in prison that is allowable under law. And so it's meant to get the hardest and worst criminals off the street, but it turns out that our 3 strikes policy back in New Zealand means you can have a situation where someone commits murder, gets their 1st strike and goes to prison, pinches someone's bottom in prison, which turns out to be indecent assault, which is a 2nd strike, and thus if they then shoplift when they get out of prison for the 2nd time, will have to go to prison for 18 years without parole. And so the Ministry of Justice has said this is manifestly unjust. This stops judges from being able to exercise their discretion when sentencing people. And Simon Bridges has said, look, I have received information from the Ministry of Justice that shows that since the 3 strikes law was imposed in the jurisdiction of Aotearoa, New Zealand 5 years ago, criminal offending has been going down. So this is evidence to some extent the 3 strikes laws work. And so he said this in a press release, at which point the Ministry of Justice said, that is true. In the last 5 years, criminal offending has gone down. But the information we released to the National Party and Mr. Bridges stated that you cannot use this as evidence the 3 strikes law is working because of other changes in the criminal justice system that have occurred at the same time. We put a lot of caveats in front of that claim, and Mr. Bridges should be telling people about the caveats before making such bold claims. And some people have said what Mr. Bridges was doing there was spreading fake news, misleading people by design, particularly his target audience, people who will be voting in the next general election. And there's another example here where there was a recent by-election in Auckland in the electorate of Northcote, where the National Party won that by-election. The narrative that came out from the National Party at the time is, if a party in opposition wins a by-election, that is a signal that the government is failing, because otherwise, if the government was popular, why wouldn't the government party member win? At which point the Electoral Commission went, yes, but only 28% of the population of that electorate voted in that election, which means that, yes, it's true that the National Party candidate got 51% of the vote, but that was only 20.36% of potential voters in that electorate. That kind of indicates people didn't think this was a particular election, which is due to our mixed proportional system. So once again, Simon Bridges was making claims which are true, but was using selective citation of information, which does make it look like he's misleading a target audience by design, which makes it look as if maybe he's disseminating fake news. And of course we find other examples. Donald Trump, quite famously, got very, very angry that reporters made the claim that his inauguration crowds weren't particularly big. Now, admittedly, Donald Trump said he had the biggest crowds of any inauguration at any time. There's a photo of the inauguration ceremony. I could embarrass Mr. Trump even further by showing pictures of Obama's second inauguration, which has a much larger crowd. But Trump was right to point out that reporters didn't state something which was important. The forecast for Inauguration Day was for very bad weather, and understandably, people don't like to go out in the pouring rain to see a small ant-like figure at a distance over a loudspeaker system that makes everything sound a little bit like this, because it's not a particularly historic moment to witness if you then go home and get a cold. And so Donald Trump was saying, look, this is the media providing misleading statements about what's going on here, surely that's fake news. We'll be coming back to Mr. Trump later on in this talk. He's a wealth of claims of fake news. But of course the problem is, maybe Simon Bridges isn't disseminating fake news. Maybe Simon Bridges is an idiot. So maybe Simon Bridges doesn't know what the base rate fallacy is, and thus doesn't realise that if you're going to talk about the number of people voting, then you need to be talking about the overall population and what that number reflects. And maybe Simon Bridges is of the kind of person who just glosses over documents and doesn't read any of the preliminary report that tells you about what the caveats of the findings are. He just looks for numbers and then go, well, those numbers are lower than those numbers. Ipso facto, the three strikes law work. If we're going to be talking about misleading by design, we need to be saying something about what the person misleading is intending to do. And we'll be coming back to that later on. That is, sometimes false evidence in a story might be there by accident or just added in inadvertently. So the presence of false information, or even the presence of selective data usage, doesn't necessarily tell us that someone is misleading us. It suggests a whole bunch of other possibilities, and we have to make assumptions about intentions to get there. Let me now take you back in time to 1878. In 1878, on the 17th of February, the major newspaper in Auckland, in Aotearoa, New Zealand, produced this story: War with Russia, a calamity for Auckland, hostile visit of a Russian ironclad, seizure of gold and hostages. The story basically claimed that overnight a Russian warship by the name of Kaskowski had travelled into the Auckland harbour and begun a hostile takeover of Auckland, seizing gold and goods from prominent businesses and the town hall. The editor of the Daily Southern Cross, David Lucky, then wrote an article warning Aucklanders of the danger, ending with the claim, "Where is the British Navy?" Understandably, people in Auckland were somewhat concerned by the presence of a Russian warship. Allegedly, people having read the paper early in the morning at 6 a.m. walked down to the edge of the harbour to look at the ships in port to see what colours they were about to fly, to work out which ships were on their side and which ships belonged to the Russians. People were locking up their wealth and, in some cases, locking up their family to protect them from Russian marauders in the strait. And yet, there were certain elements of the story which keen readers would have spotted were a bit weird. For one thing, the event being reported had allegedly occurred 3 months earlier, something the editor goes to great lengths to point out by putting an asterisk beside the date of the event every time it's noted. Secondly, the name of the ship is Kaskowski, or, in English, cask of whiskey, given that the editor of the Daily Southern Cross was a Scotsman, who was basically trying to point out that you can make anything sound Russian if you just write it in an unusual way. This is prior to the advent of claiming that all you need to do to show something is Russian is turn your R around, which suddenly makes it into Cyrillic script, apparently. So this was a hoax story. David Lucky, the editor of the Daily Southern Cross, had decided that he needed to point out to Aucklanders and to New Zealand as a whole that New Zealand was not safe from invasion, because even though we were a British colony and thus part of the British Empire, there were no British warships in our waters whatsoever, which meant that if a hostile power decided to come and seize control, they could. And actually this was not an unreasonable thing to think at the time. At the time, the UK and the US were in a hostile relationship, and we now know that America at the time had a fully worked out plan for the invasion of Australia and New Zealand to seize them for their own control, given they were already eyeing up Hawaii and the Pacific at that particular point in time. We were taken to be a geographically important part of the world, and thus hostile powers were in fact thinking of taking us over. So this particular story from 1878 is a story where the news is fake, but the editor, David Lucky, went out of his way to try and make sure that people would be aware it was a hoax designed to spur debate as opposed to trying to convince people. And actually it's quite interesting to look at the news reporting about this story at the time. The rival Auckland newspaper, the Auckland Star, reports on the story saying, "We think this is very, very unlikely. We don't think the Russian ironclad is here to seize control. We simply think they're here to buy new suits from a recently opened retail store on Queen Street." So the other major Auckland newspaper gets in on the act. The Wellington newspapers basically pour scorn on the stupidity of the Aucklanders who believed the story at the time, although it's actually now hard to know whether the reports of panic and calamity that were going on at the time actually did occur, or whether that was also news that was fake at the time. But we don't have to look particularly far to find examples of journals and periodicals which do seem to be actually producing what we would call fake news. The Journal of American Physicians and Surgeons is published by the Association of American Physicians and Surgeons. This association was founded in 1943 as a non-profit association to fight back against socialized medicine in the US. And the Journal of American Physicians and Surgeons publishes an awful lot of scientific articles on hypotheses such as the denial between the HIV virus and AIDS, the link between the MMR, so the measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine schedule, and autism, and the link between abortions and the development of breast cancer. So the Journal of American Physicians and Surgeons produces research which argues against commonly or well-accepted medical hypotheses in the medical fraternity. Not just that, but they claim that the people who publish in their paper are unable to publish in mainstream medical journals because of a liberal medical conspiracy against them to try and shut down debate on these vital issues. Now, of course, medical conspiracies do actually occur. In the US, we had the, I say we, I'm not even slightly American. In the US, they had the Tunguski study of untreated syphilis in the Negro male, aka the Tunguski syphilis study, where American doctors were deliberately not treating African Americans with syphilis so they could track the progress of the disease over long periods of time. So people would go in saying, "I think I have syphilis," and doctors would say, no, you don't, it's fine. And then they would spend the next few years watching the progression of the disease to work out its pathology. This actually happened. And of course, currently we have a big issue in pharmacological research in that pharmaceutical companies do not like to publish null results of pharmacological research trials, which would show that, say, certain drugs don't have the results they do, in part because there's no profit in publishing null results, but also because it allows them to continue testing for new drugs in strange and unusual ways. And there's been quite a lot of research work written by medical professionals about how this is actually a conspiracy in the pharmacological community to try and garner more research funding from governments. Much better to not admit a trial works and apply for more money than to admit that this particular research is not working out and thus crushing your ability to apply for funding for further tests on those particular things. But even if we grant that there are some grounds to think that medical conspiracies occur, this doesn't automatically give us reason to think the conspiracy theories espoused by this particular journal are going to be warranted. I.e., are we once again dealing with a reasonable disagreement between the editors and the people who produce the research for the Journal for American Physicians and Surgeons? Or is this journal producing fake news? i.e., are they trying to create the appearance of a debate in the medical literature to be able to push their own political agendas? And this once again gets us to the question, what is the intent behind the production of fake news? Which means that if we're talking about fake news, we're not just talking about a spectrum between fake and factual, between low resemblance to the world and high resemblance to the world. We are also talking about some kind of talk of intentionality, where you have insincere claims, where people are misleading by design, and sincere claims, where people are not deliberately misleading anyone at all. And presumably, fake news is going to sit somewhere at the bottom, in the bottom two quadrants of this graph, where the intention to mislead is the important operating factor here between low resemblance fake news, news which literally is filled with fabrications, and fake news which does resemble the world to a large extent, but is selective or misleading by the way that data is used to make someone think some further claim. So presumably, we can have all these different types of fake news, and the question then becomes, what can we say about what the intention of the production is? And we're going to, once again, we will continue to talk about this throughout the talk. But let me step to one side here and talk about a different issue, which will get us back to the intentionality, and that is the scale of the problem. So one of the reasons why we have this contemporary discussion of fake news is that fake news is seen to be a problem now. So we have world leaders, whether it be Donald Trump, Viktor Orban, Vladimir Putin, or even the leader of PSD in Romania, making claims about fake news in media discourse and the way that that media discourse is impacting the way that governments are able to act on the national and world stage. So it's one thing to define fake news and to say what is fake news and what isn't fake news. It's another thing to judge the scale of the problem of fake news. And in part that's because it's not clear that even though we have a contemporary problem of fake news, that fake news is in any way a new issue. It's also not clear it's a bigger issue now than it ever has been in the past. What it might be is simply more central to political debate at this particular point in time. And I mean, we can say a whole bunch of things about this. Media coverage, for example, has always been partisan. I was having a discussion with a colleague the other day. One of the issues about being a New Zealander is that we only have one major newspaper. This is the New Zealand Herald. So we have a population of 4.4 million people, very sparsely spread out on a country which is larger than the UK by way of landmass. And so we just don't have the population density to justify having more than one national paper in the current economic setting. And so we have one newspaper which is basically aimed at the entire population, although actually it's technically aimed at house owners who happen to belong to the boomer generation, people born just after World War II. But most nation states have multiple newspapers, and those multiple newspapers tend to have quite deliberate viewpoints. The UK is a great example where you have things like The Sun, the Daily Mirror, The Guardian, The Telegraph, The Economist, all sorts of different newspapers with different political agendas presenting a diverse set of viewpoints, and readers of those newspapers have a fairly good idea of what they're getting themselves into. Unfortunately, in New Zealand, you can only read about how house prices are both a boon and a destructive influence in the country because we only have one newspaper to be able to refer back to as our journal of note. We also have the issue that the idea that journalism is simply just the facts, if it's even true, may simply be a modern invention. So there's this notion that newspapers are simply meant to produce the facts and audiences are meant to infer things from them. But it's not clear that that has always been true, and arguably it's not even clear that it actually ever has been true. And indeed, newspapers in the past have published sensationalized stories and fake news stories, like that of the Casker Whiskey hoax. And my favorite example of this is this little newspaper. Alarming experience of fair bathers who are attacked by an octopus. This is the Illustrated Police News. It was a Victorian tabloid produced between, I think, the 1870s. I think it finished publication in 1908. I'm not contradicted there by the copy I'm seeing in front of me. And the Illustrated Police News reported on crimes and misdemeanors, mostly in London, but sometimes in the UK as a whole. Some of its stories were edited for dramatic effect. Others of its stories were either largely or completely fabricated. And it peddled what we would now label as fake news, and that it peddled misleading claims by design to a target audience, in this case Victorians who wanted tantalizing tales of misdemeanors and crimes. And there are lots of examples of this particular type of newspaper in the UK and the US, which are happy to report things which, as far as we know, did occur. There's actually an entire field of study in folkloric studies actually looking at issues of the Illustrated Police News and other tabloids to find out whether any of the stories they printed were actually true, or whether they were all sensationalized to at least some part. And they produced stories of this type which people lapped up. Now, in the defense of the editors of the Illustrated Police News, people seemed to know what they were buying at the time. People didn't seem to think that if they read it in the Illustrated Police News, it must be true. It was kind of accepted that some of the things you read in the papers are going to be sensationalized to a certain extent, and some of the things you read in the papers are going to be too good to be true, i.e. people were aware there was a certain amount of fakeness in their media landscape. And maybe part of the problem we have with fake news today is that maybe we aren't, as a society, as media literate as maybe we were in the past, although that's a fairly strong claim. You probably need a sociologist to be able to back that up, but it's a suspicion I have. So fake news seems to have been with us for quite some time. But is the problem bigger? Because if we're measuring fake news, and we're saying fake news is a problem because of its presence and its prevalence, then we're probably making some claim that fake news is bigger now than ever, and of course this ends up being ambiguous, because we might be saying there's more of it, i.e. there's more fake news today than there was in the past, or it might be that fake news is a bigger issue regardless of the incidence level, rather than it's a bigger issue because of its role in contemporary discourse. And in this respect, fake news actually might resemble my other area of study, conspiracy theories. So there's quite a lot of literature that covers the incidence of belief in conspiracy theories now as opposed to the 1960s and the 1930s. The common wisdom is there are more conspiracy theories today than there ever have been in Western civilization. The actual data indicates that the height of conspiracy theory belief was the 1960s, and conspiracy theories have been becoming increasingly unpopular up until about 2016, which is where the survey data ends. It's quite possible that with the rise of Trump in America, Orban in Hungary and the like, that maybe conspiracy theories are becoming more popular again, but it does seem the problem of conspiracy theories numerically is reduced, even if it turns out that the contemporary discourse appears to be more full of conspiracy theories than ever before. And that might also be the case of fake news. It may have been we had more fake news in the past, but maybe we didn't talk about it as much as we do today. In part, there's actually a lot of research into this, into crime statistics. So a lot of law and order parties at this particular moment in time are getting in on saying crime is worse than it's ever been before. Except that when you look at the stats, crime is nowhere near as bad as it was 10 years ago, let alone 20 years ago in almost every country in the world. But of course, crime is now more newsworthy because as it occurs less often, it's more worthy of the news in the newspaper. So we report on crime more, which makes it look as if there's more crime going on, even though the stats indicate otherwise. And of course, we can't say much about the incidence of fake news with respect to people making accusations of fake news, because of course, many of those accusations might be insincere. It's possible to live in a world where there is no fake news, despite what Donald J. Trump has to say about fake news. Or it's possible to live in a world where fake news is rife, but no one actually ever mentions it. So it's quite possible to live in a world where we're just far too polite to mention the fact that our major newspapers are producing sensationalized or fabricated stories, or it's possible to live in a world where Donald Trump talks about fake news all the time and none of his accusations are at all true, and they might even be insincere. And as I said before, it is possible that there was more fake news in the past, but there may have been more fake news in the past because people were more attentive to what the issues with regard to the production of fake news were, and also more able to spot sensationalized or fabricated stories in their media discourses. And once again, this means we have to circle back around to what is the intention of the people who are said to be producing this purported fake news. Because anything which is misleading by design means that it's misleading because someone intended it to be that way towards some target audience. And as philosophers of action have pointed out since the 1960s, working out the intentions of agents is actually very difficult because intentions are internal mental states which most of us don't have easy access to. I say most of us, none of us have easy access to other people's internal mental states, unless, of course, you believe certain conspiracy theories about mind control experiments committed by the CIA in the 1960s where they developed mind-reading devices. So maybe some people have, but most of us are only able to work out the intention of others through behavioral cues, which often aren't particularly accurate. Now, of course, sometimes it is relatively easy. So, if George Smathers really did give that talk about Claude Pepper, it's fairly easy to tell by the language and the target audience he was working with that he was trying to mislead his target audience. He had not gone there to praise Caesar, but rather to bury him for being for having a Homo sapien brother, a thespian sister, and someone who practiced celibacy before marriage, the moral degenerate. But of course, the Simon Bridges case, leader of the National Party of New Zealand, we have to make an assumption here. Was Simon Bridges being sincere but stupid about the Ministry of Justice data, or was Simon Bridges being clever and insincere and trying to mislead his audience? And of course, depending on who you talk to back home, you will get different answers. So most of my friends back home are left-leaning Labour voters who think that Simon Bridges is one of the worst people you can possibly imagine, and thus it's easy to imagine he was being insincere and misleading by design. I, on the other hand, still being left-leaning but not so pessimistic, do have worries about Simon Bridges and his intellectual nuance, given he's a career politician who became a elected local government official at the age of 20, doesn't have any advanced degrees of any particular kind, and has been a career politician for his life. I have a feeling that maybe he just doesn't actually understand how numbers work, and thus isn't actually the kind of person you should rely upon when it comes to data from the Ministry of Justice or about elections. So maybe he's not being insincere, he doesn't intend to mislead by design, he's just not very clever. But then again, that could also be explained by my left-leaning nature there, because I, of course, would be the kind of person who couldn't assume that someone from a right-wing party could be in any way intelligent. Assumptions are driving so much of this discourse about what people are intending here. So often, if we want to talk about the intentions of agents, we kind of have to fall back on judgments about the reliability or the trustworthiness of sources. And this, of course, has been a topic in social epistemology for several decades now. Social epistemology deals with how we deal with knowledge claims in a kind of collective social environment, especially how we work out the knowledge claims with respect to how institutions work, how societal complexes work, and the kind of motivations and background information that individuals in complex societies have. So it treats epistemic agents, individuals like you and I, as being part of a complex of a social community, with all of the background assumptions, priors, and the like, which lend weight to the kind of epistemic decisions we make, and sometimes make those good epistemic decisions, and sometimes lead us down the garden path to believing all sorts of strange and weird things. So there's a big literature on this. And so we can talk about the reliability of institutions, and we can talk about the trustworthiness of individuals, but that only takes us so far, because even if we can talk about intentions, and we can try and infer the intentions of individual epistemic agents based upon population data and the like, the way institutions have operated in the past, that only goes so far to tell us what we think people might be thinking, and also it doesn't necessarily tell us much about why people might treat what is being said as being news or newsworthy. Because the problem of intentions is compounded by the fact that we don't just have to talk about what people intended to do, but also which audiences they intended to target. So sometimes we can easily infer the target audience of some particular piece of fake news. If you know that The Guardian is read by tea-drinking liberals who live in London, then you know that if there's some news which is fake in The Guardian, it's being aimed at a particular section of the British population. That's the issue we have, of course, with fake news back home. We only have one newspaper, which is meant to be for everyone, and thus it's much harder to work out who the target audience for some piece of news is meant to be, although it's almost always boomers who happen to own houses, because they're the only people who apparently count in our political system. They're also the only people who vote in our political system, so technically they are the only people who do count when it comes to our political economy. And of course, sometimes we can infer the target audience of some news outlet by the kind of stories they produce. So we can't just talk about who buys the newspaper, but we can also talk about who they're trying to aim the newspaper towards. But if there's a problem working out the intention of the producers, then there's going to be a problem with working out the intention of those they are intending to mislead. And that's why these things actually end up being quite interesting. So I suspect almost everyone here has received what's commonly called a Nigerian 911 scam. So the 911 refers to the criminal code that these things contravene in Nigeria. It's a classic case where you receive an email from some executor of an estate of an illustrious individual who died about 21 days ago and left their money with no particular target audience in mind, or someone whose name is very close to yours. And the executor, who apparently is a very immoral person, wants to share this wealth with you. So if you would please respond to this email, they can set up the process of sending 10% of the proceeds to your bank account. Now, most of us, when we read these emails, immediately go, this is a scam. And thus we delete the email and move on. And in part, we think these are a scam because A, the claim is extraordinary and seems unlikely, but also the letters, which are apparently from lawyers, are littered with weird typographical mistakes, cases where they go, dear target name, and things like that. Now, people study these things. So people study these things in computational theory, people study these things in epistemology, and the operating theory is these letters are written deceptively and badly by design, because by making the letter as implausible as possible, people like us, who might investigate it and report upon it, will just get rid of the email immediately. The kind of people who read these emails and are able to gloss over the problems are the kind of people who are going to respond to the email. And they're the kind of people who, in 3 weeks' time, after engaging in correspondence with the executor of the state of Mr. Mbeki, are going to respond to the claim, now I need $5,000 sent from your bank account to mine as a kind of insurance before we transfer the full amount back to you, and thus they are the people who send the money on, and thus the scammers make their money. And on a personal note, I have an aunt who tried to respond positively to one of these Nigerian scam things. The only thing which stopped her from doing it was a lack of a fax machine. So this was a Nigerian scam letter which actually appeared in the post as opposed to email, because my aunt doesn't use email. And it required her to fax her information to a Nigerian number. She got in contact with my mother, and my mother said, no, that's a scam. My aunt said, no, it's not. It seems genuine. And so I was then called upon to persuade my aunt that this was not true. My mother's word doesn't mean anything, but apparently the sunshine shines out of my ass, and thus my aunt will believe anything I tell her. I should have just told her to give me the $5,000 herself, and I would have dealt with the issue. Actually, now I think that I should have done that. I could have 5,000 NZ dollars. It's almost 4,000 euros. So the whole point of this is that there's a target audience here, but the target audience is not everybody who receives the email. It's a subsection of people who are going to respond positively to it. So even if we can make some claim about potential targets for some piece of news which is fake or fake news, the intention may not be for everyone. It might be for a subsection of what we take to be the target. I.e., Donald Trump's proclamations about fake news are meant to energize the Republican base, but of course there are certain people who are going to vote for Donald Trump no matter what, because he's a Republican, and indeed what he needs to do is energize the base that would normally vote Republican but can't be bothered to vote on polling day, by energizing them with salacious stories about a liberal conspiracy to shut him down, despite the fact he appears to have much more free speech than most other people do within that political situation. So yeah, target audiences here are hard to infer. And we can make some broad claims. Fake news which is merely selective, i.e. has a high resemblance to the world, is probably going to have a broader target audience than fake news which is highly fabricated, because highly fabricated news requires you either to not know much about the world or be able to compartmentalize your beliefs about the world to be able to then accept that strange and unusual claims might be true. But once again, if we're making those claims, we have to make some claim about the intentions of the people who are producing it, because there is always another option here, which is that the fake news might still just be an example of sloppy reporting. And that's always going to be the issue with judging any news which is fake, which has high resemblance but some false information in there. That might just be journalists not doing their job properly. And that's still a bad thing. Sloppy reporting is bad for any political system. But it's a very different problem in kind from people intentionally misleading others. Now, of course, none of this is to say that we should be resiling from talk of fake news, or indeed trying to find a way to measure fake news, work out what is fake news and what is not fake news. Rather, it speaks to a fundamental problem of what is fake news, which is that depending on the definition we use, we're going to have issues judging what is fake and what is not, due to whether we can judge the intention of the producers of that news, and also what the target audience of that news happens to be. And of course, that's 50 minutes of talk on the first order issue of just working out what is fake news and what is not. But there's a second order issue, which I'm going to cover very briefly, which are allegations of fake news. Because if there's a problem with the centrality of fake news in the media landscape, the problem might not be the existence of fake news. The problem might be the term "that's just fake news" has been weaponized by particular political leaders. Like, say, these ones here. So an American, a Hungarian, and a Romanian walk into the room, and you can't trust a single thing they say. It's also quite remarkable that world leaders are beginning to look more and more the same. If you transferred a certain Romanian leader's moustache to that of an American or a Hungarian leader, they basically look like they could just be the same person. It's times like this, I think, that David Icke, who believes in alien shape-shifting reptiles controlling the world, might be right, because those literally might be lizards wearing human skin. Everything looks like an ill-fitting suit. So alleging something is fake news doesn't, of course, tell us it is news which is fake. But if you're going to make the claim that's fake news, for it to have any weight in political discourse, the person making the claim has to have some kind of institutional authority, or there needs to be some kind of institutional feature. In that these allegations are only persuasive in contemporary discourse if the person making the claim has some kind of authority on the matter. And of course, authority here might be epistemic. They literally are saying, this is news which is fake, I'm a subject expert. Or that authority could be political. This is fake because I'm the president and I'm telling you this is the case. So, of course, some claims of news being fake will be cases of people saying this is news which is actually fake, and then not being insincere. But it seems the problem of fake news is that many of the allegations of fake news are allegations we take to be insincere and are simply examples of people pragmatically trying to avoid criticism or deflect blame for what their governments are doing at any particular point in time. Now, this is not to say that individuals like ourselves can't say that's fake news. In certain power situations, we can make those claims and it will work. If your partner says, a friend of mine saw you kissing someone the other day, you might say that's fake news. And because of the power relationship, that may or may not work. But the kind of fake news that we're concerned about tends to be the claims of fake news by people who look a lot like that. These are the people that when they say that's fake news, we're concerned that they're not saying it because they've spotted news which is fake in the world. They're saying it because it's a very easy way to avoid having to discuss the nuance of an issue or admit that maybe criticisms of them and their government actually might be justified. And to get to why I called this What is Fake About Fake News without the question mark, despite the fact that the version of the title I sent to Mikna actually had a question mark at the end, I changed my mind. The reason why we might say fake news is fake is that we probably actually don't need to use the term fake news to discuss any of this phenomena. In fact, I was having a discussion with some Germans just last week about this, and we were going, is fake news even going to be a term we talk about in 10 years' time? So once we pass the Trump imperium, as long as we don't get Trump 2, Trump 3, Jared Trump, Barron Trump, and then the clones of Trump in 2020, then we're going to go back to how we normally talk about assessing information in the world. So fake news is not a new category of information. It's simply an umbrella term for how we discuss news or stories which happen to be fake or alleged to be fake. And we talk about the reliability of news sources, the trustworthiness of information within the world, and the tricky nature under which we try to work out what people intend, and whether we can work out what audiences they intend to have that effect upon. But for social epistemologists like myself, what's real about fake news is that it allows people like me to talk about why what we do is important. It allows us to show that epistemology has a real world effect. And they're able to talk about, look, when it comes to judging information from sources, there is a long tradition in philosophy talking about how reliable is a source, how trustworthy is a source, and what do people intend when they say things. And this, of course, is what makes fake news so exciting, despite the fact that, according to Donald J. Trump, most of what I have just said is, of course, a huge problem. It's very sad and is quite definitely just fake news. Finish. I spent a turn black at that one.